Missouri is playing a key role now in the balance of power for Congress. Our Missouri Capitol reporter Hannah Falcon breaks down the latest legal battle.
Missouri lawmakers drew a new congressional map last year that favors Republicans. It was challenged by a citizen veto petition. Secretary of State Denny Hoskins rejected the petition, saying the Constitution only allows state lawmakers to draw these district lines, a move Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe backs up.
Secretary Hoskins is very passionate about this issue. He spent a lot of time with a lot of people who understand what this means for our Constitution, and so I think he's done a lot of research and represents the feelings of a lot of Missourians when he says that.
The Missouri Constitution is quite clear that the people reserve the power to vote, to have a referendum on any act of the General Assembly.
Richard Von Glahn with People Not Politicians argues Missouri should have been under the old map since they turned in their petition back in December of 2025. This year's midterm election across the country has the potential to shift the balance of power in the U.S. House of Representatives. That's why this lawsuit in Missouri is drawing national attention, as a lawyer from the Republican National Committee is joining to argue the state's case.
Democracy works best when people are the center of it, not when politicians and insiders.
Yeah, I don't make predictions on what happens in court. It's, we've seen things and multiple different issues go multiple ways.
A Cole County judge will hear the case next week. Whatever decision is made will just be the first step on this legal battle's way to the Missouri Supreme Court. And it will have to move quickly because the case needs to be settled before November ballots are finalized on September 8th. Reporting in Jefferson City, I'm Hannah Falcon.